Hey folks, and welcome on in to the nerdiest video you're going to see today. My name is Dr. Luke Hobson. I'm an instructional designer from MIT. I'm also the creator of Instructional Design Institute and the host of a Dr. Luke Hobson podcast. And you can find all my information over at drlukehobson.com. My purpose is to help you make the online learning experience more meaningful for you and for your students. And today's video, it is a celebratory extravaganza Q&A episode because somehow this super learning nerd channel has reached 500 subscribers and 7,500 views over just the last couple of months. This channel hasn't been out for that long, but you are absolutely awesome. And because of you, that is why this channel is growing and I'm able to do more things. So a humongous thank you to all of those of you who subscribe and have been following along for me with this instructional design journey, however long you have been following along. And this episode, well, it's for you. You have your questions and I reached out to you and just asked, hey, what's one thing that you want to know about with instructional design? Could be anything from online learning, ID, or whatever it is. So I was able to talk to a bunch of you through the Facebook group, Instructional Design Institute Community. Join that group if you haven't yet. I also asked you on LinkedIn, Twitter, and then on just the mailing list, which is at drlukehobson.com. I pulled together all of your questions, compiled them, and now we're going to go through a bunch of them. And not surprising at all, you are all intelligent and amazing people. So some of the questions you asked me are incredibly difficult. And I had to stop and think and write out my answer and then practice because I was like, oh my gosh, I could answer some of these questions in 1,000 different ways. But I want to give you, of course, the very best possible answer. I am going to be mentioning a ton of different types of resources. So down below within this description section for YouTube, I am just going to list out every single possible resource that I mentioned, any book, any software, any tool, or what, I'm going to be talking about a ton of different things. So for anything I mentioned, go down below. You're going to find that link, and that's going to help you find the resource. Okay, let's get started. And our first question comes from Ben. And Ben asks, when a project has a tight due date, which is pretty much all projects, we have to make hard decisions on quality and what's good enough. How do you determine what a baseline good enough learning experience should be? And when might you hold back or delay the delivery if quality is falling below your baseline? Ben, absolutely great question. And for this, I have three answers. First, let me tell you about the right thing to say, which is that no matter what, the student learning experience should be the top priority. It should be number one, and nothing should impact that in a negative way. Now, let me give you the second answer, which is human beings are not perfect and things are going to happen. So then it's all about trying to pivot and figure out what to do if something does occur. And this kind of goes into my third answer, which is combining everything. So, what is something that could potentially happen that could delay the project? Well, perhaps a SME is missing their deadlines or they're not being responsive. Perhaps there's somebody on the team who's absolutely valuable and then they quit. They give you an unexpected leave of absence or something happens to them. Or perhaps someone on the team falls ill. They're dealing with an emergency and now you're trying to quickly backfill what they used to bring to the table and try to make sure that the project isn't going to fall apart. Those things can happen. Then it's up to you as the instructional designer to think about that learning experience and what could you necessarily adapt and change in order to make something still be absolutely incredible for the student. So to give you an example, think about if a SME is going to be developing 10 videos, let's say, for a module. Now, they don't deliver. They tell you, hey, something came up. I was only able to actually give you 5. I know we have a super tight deadline. It's the very best I can do. Okay, realistic type of a situation here. So then, as the instructional designer, you can say, all right, there is a chunk of time and information that now we need to backfill with something different. What can we do if we don't have, say, 30 minutes of video content that we could take into a 30-minute exercise or activity? And this is something that's actually can be kind of fun because now you're like, all right, how can I make this more engaging? How can I make this so that the student isn't going to be doing something that's a bit more passive as like another reading, another video, but perhaps something that's really going to make them dive in and be like, wow, like what is this? What am I learning about? So, from a sense, it's also trying to think about it from a different mental mindset, I guess, of think about this more as an opportunity. What can you do to try to make something even better than originally it was actually planned for? Now, what I would also recommend that you do, if possible, I know not everyone can do this, but I will always highly, highly encourage it, if at all, whenever possible. I run pilot programs for every single course, no matter what. I run a pilot program. Why? Well, it's because of the fact that I am not the student. I don't understand fully the learning experience that they are going to be going through. So perhaps to me, this is the very best I can possibly make it. And then I find out from talking to these students and from listening to them that no, I could do something that perhaps is more relevant to what they're doing in their careers or their jobs. Perhaps I could take something for an activity and change it up a little bit so that that way it's going to be more of an estimated time that I thought they were going to be completing it in. Perhaps I said it should only take you an hour to do, and then all of a sudden they're like, oh my gosh, this took me 10 hours. I'm like, oh, whoops, clearly didn't get that one right. So it's trying to figure out from these pilot programs, from both surveys and interviews, I would recommend doing both, but you can then gather as much information as possible in order to make that learning experience better. Now, on the flip side of that, too, to go back to your question, is that a pilot program is going to give you a bit more wiggle room. It's going to give you a bit of a buffer. Why? Well, it's because students know that this is a pilot program. This is not perfect. It's not complete. So if something seems a little bit off to them, they're going to obviously tell you, but at least you know, but this isn't negatively impacting their learning, which is, of course, once again, the top priority. So, hey, Ben, hope that helps you with your question. Next question comes from Jason. Actually, the next two questions come from Jason because they were both great. So I wanted to make sure to include both of them in this video. And Jason asks, you're talking to an institute of higher education that wants to start this whole instructional design thing, but that institute is full of people who don't get it. They don't want it. The whole I've been teaching for 35 years, my way or the highway. You can't teach this online. So it's like this old school mentality is what Jason's really referring to. How do you convince them of the viability of online education? Jason, absolutely fantastic question. And I know that many people in this instructional design world who perhaps they're being employed for the very first time in an organization that has never done instructional design. So this is all very new to them. So there's going to clearly be this barrier that you need to remove right from the get go. You're talking about essentially someone who has a negative perception about just online learning in general. And perhaps they're thinking that this is not going to be as valuable compared to face to face learning. So that certainly comes from having an open dialogue and listening to these potential faculty members or whoever hired you in the first place to come aboard, of just listen as to why. Why do they think and why do they feel this way? Most of them are actually going to give you a reason. Perhaps they had a negative experience with designing an online course before and it didn't go so well. Perhaps they just have no idea and they just been reading in the news about how remote learning is literally ruining everything with society. So now they're like, oh my gosh. And of course, everything that happened with our country and around the world, that was more of emergency learning. That was not real, viable online learning, which is, of course, very different. So that's where I would start off with. And then from there, what I would then do would be to collect information and then data from other different universities and institutions and colleges and figure out what they did in order to make their online learning program successful. How did they make their instructors adopt this whole new way of thinking that perhaps they never once thought about? And I know for me, working at MIT, I've had some conversations with folks who, they never before thought about online learning, but really they they didn't realize the capacity of what you can do with online learning, the amount of learning science, the amount of learning analytics, learning strategies, what you can really bring to the table. Sometimes they're like, whoa, you can do what exactly? It's like, yeah, this whole thing of just taking something face to face and then moving it into online, literally the exact same way and replicating that same experience. That's not going to work. You need to change it up and to make it better, not necessarily change the course content, but we need to change up that delivery, that style. And that's what's really going to hit home for students. Now, of course, the other thing that you could mention about too is that, hey, if we don't change and go into this online type of direction, well, we have case studies from around the world of what schools couldn't do that in time or they didn't do it well enough. And then unfortunately, well, they had to close down because, of course, the students didn't enjoy it. The faculty didn't enjoy it. No one was having a good time. And because of that, the enrollment stopped, the revenue stopped, and then therefore they had to shut down. So, not like I want to scare people and say, like, oh my gosh, look at what's happening within our entire world. But we also need to talk realistically speaking for 2021 and the future. Think about what's happened. We need to avoid going into that same pitfall that a couple of other people have unfortunately gone through. Next question also comes from Jason. And then Jason says, how long does it take you to design a course from start to finish? This one is at least a much easier question. So the answer to this question, it definitely depends upon time, energy, resources, who's on the team, how many SMEs. So there's a couple of different factors that obviously goes into everything. But I would say across the board, about 3 to 6 months is generally how long it takes me to design a course from start to finish. And within that, I'm also including the pilot program too. Once again, I do a pilot program for every single course. So if something is going to take me a little bit extra time, well, then I need to think about that and to buffer that into everything. Now, for some of the courses, they're only a couple weeks in length, and other times you're building out a course that potentially is 12 weeks or longer. So once again, a ton of different variables, a ton of different factors, but short and sweet. 3 to 6 months. All right. Our next question comes from Scott. And Scott says, here's my question for one of your future podcasts. When developing training or courses with faculty, how do you introduce the topic of diversity and inclusion into the conversation when discussing representation of marginalized groups, whether they be racial, ethnic, LGBTQ, etc., in curriculum, activities, and assessments? Scott, I know I mentioned this to you offline, but I want to say this to all of our listeners and watchers over here too on YouTube, is that this is such an important question. I cannot do it justice with just giving a 3 to 5 minute answer here on this Q&A video. And as I told Scott, and I'm going to be telling all of you too, this is all these topics extremely important to me and important to our world right now as a society. So this is going to take a little bit more time, and I want to be able to dedicate a ton of time to this in a future podcast episode covering all the ins and outs of everything. So in the future, I'm going to be going into all of this and really doing this question justice with all the necessary and important details. Our next question comes from Kim. What is the one book every instructional designer should have and why? I am trying to build my resources, so I am especially curious. Kim, fantastic question. Extremely difficult question, as I have a million book recommendations I would love to give you. And depending upon when this video comes out, there could be another new book that comes out. They keep on coming out again and again and again, which is great for our field. But if I had to pick one, I would tell you about the book that I first read as an instructional designer, which is this one, which is called UDL in the Cloud. And this is by Tom Thibodeau and by Dr. Katie Novak. Now, why this book in particular? When I was first getting into this field, I luckily read this book beforehand, and this made me take a different type of mindset of how I was developing my resources at the time. And this makes me think about, how do I design for everybody? How do I provide flexibility? How do I remove barriers. All things I really didn't necessarily think about because back then, as I was designing some of these resources for the Writing Center, the Peer Tutoring Center, and the online learning communities, I was thinking more about just the content. I wasn't really thinking about the student perspective, the learner's perspective. And this book in particular really changed my mind about how I construct everything. Now, to give you an example of how I still use what I learned about this book, I still use its information to this day. So, to give you an example, is that I was creating leadership courses for MIT, and it came up where some of the students were talking about in the exit interview. So, in this pilot program that I do, and they were talking about how they wanted to be more engaged in the course content, but they didn't know how. Now, this was fascinating because they didn't have an answer to the problem. They were just telling me their problem. And I was like, okay, do you want more readings? They're like, no. Like, okay, what if you had more videos? Like, no. Okay, if I made you more practice questions and reflections and applications and problems, would you want to do those? They're like, no. So then I said, well, why? What's the problem? And they said, well, our problem is time. I don't have the time to do this. So then I asked them to think about their day. And I said, when do you have time in your day to do more with the course? And they said, well, it's impossible. But if I had to map it out, I have about 40 to 45 minutes in my commute going to work. And if you could somehow put something in the course in that time frame, well, then I would do it. So I'm like, so what you're saying is that if I make a podcast for your commute, you would actually listen to it? And they all said yes. So then here I go. I'm like, all right, let's make a podcast for these courses. Don't know how this is going to go. Never done this before. And it really became a humongous success. The podcasts themselves have like 2,000 downloads right now with no promotions, no nothing. It's just embedded within the courses themselves. But then tying this all back into UDL, I was thinking about ways to create content that could then be usable in a different way. But then I didn't just give it to the students who asked for it. I gave it to everybody because, of course, that is the whole point of trying to think about designing something in a universal fashion. How do you design for everybody? And that is something that I still take with me to this day. I still use in all the courses that I design and what I still try to do when I practice everything I learned about from this framework. Next question comes from Maria. And Maria asks, what are some best practices in designing interactive scenario based e learning that require software simulations? Any recommendations on applications? Maria, I have like four answers to this question. And I was trying to think about this before recording the video of what do I give first or what do I. So here is a brain dump of all things that I want to just give and share with you. But the first thing, though, is that you mentioned specifically about required e learning and software simulation for scenario based learning. And I'm not sure if that's because that is your preference or perhaps that's the organization's way of doing things. But I did want to at least mention and preface everything before I go into all this is that you don't need software or simulations or anything else when it comes to scenario based learning. I have designed a ton of different types of SBL problems where it's just having a prompt and then a open response assessment type of item, and that's it. And I can still tie everything back into the real world. I can still show clarity and transparency for what skills the students are really learning about. And then, of course, how they're going to take this knowledge and then go out and use it in the real world. So you don't need software. But from the way that you worded your question, I think that you do, and you are looking for recommendations. So the first thing I would say is that Rise is definitely a great platform. If you haven't used that one before, would highly recommend you to check that out because it's so easy and user friendly to build inside of. But they've also made an update, and I don't know when this update came out. It's a update, but it's new to me, where they did make their own scenario based branching and ways for you to go about with doing that. So I don't know if that's a new feature, but at least for I know some of you listening, you're going to be like, oh wow, I didn't know that was a thing. So that is definitely one recommendation if you did want to go ahead and use a type of software. Now, another recommendation I wanted to say is that for some of my courses, I have used Harvard Business Publishing Education. They make a ton of different amazing simulations for just about anything from accounting to leadership, strategies, marketing, economics. They have a ton that you can use. And these are really engaging, they're interactive, they're just different. They're not the typical run of the mill type of a simulation that you might think about. For the courses that I use them for, we use one that's called a change management simulation. And what this does is that it puts the student inside the shoes of somebody within an organization that is trying to lead a change initiative throughout this entire org. And then on the back end, within the scenario, you can actually pick and choose what level of responsibility they have. Are they coming in from like the CEO, like the top down, or are they coming in from somebody just starting off within the organization? And it becomes a much tougher sell, a tougher climb as they are then trying to tell other people about this idea. Now, within the simulation itself, which is really neat, is that you can actually then see how the relationships are forming as you slowly begin to take action. And you have to decide too what action item you're going to take. Are you going to be hosting a town hall meeting? Are you going to be sending out an email? Are you going to walk the talk? Are you going to be conducting a training? What are you really going to do to make somebody buy into your new idea? You can see in real time too that some people are going to love the idea. They think it's great. And other times people are like, no, not so much. I don't believe you. I don't get why you're trying to make me do this. And just like in the real world, you can accidentally step on people's toes and them actually having a bit of a uninterest in what you were going to say for going forward. So you can kind of rub them the wrong way. So it's just really fascinating because this all comes from real research too within organizations and how change was a successful thing. So I would certainly recommend to check out Harvard Business Publishing Education, see what simulations they have just from the past testimonies from students. They will go in and they will play some of these simulations again and again and again and again. Like to them, it's a real game. It's not something you're forcing them to do. They really want to be able to compete with their fellow colleagues and share what they were able to do in a period of time, how many points they got, things of that nature. So it's just really neat. Now, because you also asked about e-learning specifically and for simulations, I'm not sure if you knew, but there's actually a podcast that is all about e-learning and scenario-based learning. And this was made by Anna Sabramowitz. And this is a really interesting podcast because for some of the podcasts on instructional design, people will cover all different types of topics. But for Anna in particular, she really just like keeps on diving into SBL, and it's really cool. So I would highly recommend to check out her podcast. I know she has a few things too on LinkedIn and YouTube, so I would definitely recommend to check out her material. Now, if you're looking to learn more about SBL without using more of the software approach within Instructional Design Institute, there is actually an entire course on scenario-based learning. I try to cover it more from the learning experience design side of things. So talking about the purpose, talking about conducting the research, the follow through, how to really build things successfully. So there's an entire course where I would walk you through how to go ahead and to do all of those things. And then finally, my last answer for you is that I am hosting a workshop all about scenario based learning soon. And this is from Dr. Barbie Honeycutt's Lecture Breakers podcast. She has a virtual conference that she is hosting in June. So on June 8th to June 10th, there's going to be a slew of amazing guests talking about everything you could possibly think about from the online learning perspectives. And on June 9th, around noon, is when my session is going to begin. So if you really want to go and dive into the learning nerd weeds with me about scenario based learning, that's a perfect opportunity to do so. All right, now that I've just given you like 57 answers to that question, so sorry, Maria. I really hope your head's not spinning after I just gave you a million different things, but I wanted to make sure to cover everything. Our next question comes from Jen, and Jen asks a great question. And she says, the pandemic brought a lot of colleges and universities into the online learning world. And this is a change that's going to have a lasting impact. What do you think is the biggest opportunity that this shift has presented in higher education, as well as the biggest challenge or threat? So, Jen, let me start first by talking about the threat. And the threat is that our mentality around face to face and with online learning. The threat is really that things can just go back to normal and that everyone is just going to carry on with their lives. Simply, it's just not true. Anyone who has taken a face to face course will tell you that it's not perfect. And of course, is online learning perfect? No. But is there a way to combine the two and to get the best of both worlds? Absolutely. And what I want people to know about is to accept that there is not a one size fits all model when it comes to instruction, when it comes to education, when it comes to teaching. And that's what I really hope that people are taking away from this is just trying to think about all those gold nuggets, those pieces of wisdom and advice of what we have been reading about and learning of how remote learning and online learning can be a successful and a viable option to do so. So let me tell you a story about how I think the future is going to go. And this story comes from actually talking with Tom Thibodeau a couple of months ago, the same author of UDL in the Cloud. And he's like, Luke, let me ask you a question. It's like, all right, Tom, what's up? And he said, imagine you are hosting a dinner party. You have all of these guests coming over soon. What is the best dish to serve them? I thought about it and I'm like, thinking of quantity, thinking of what's not that expensive. I'm like, I'm not sure, Tom. He's like, well, let me give you some more information to help you make your decision. Imagine that all these guests who are coming over, they all have different types of food preferences. Some are dairy free, gluten free, soy free. Some are lactose intolerant. Some are vegan. Some are vegetarian. And I'm sitting there being like, I don't know, Tom, based off of that information. That only makes it harder. What's the best dish to serve them? And he says the answer is a buffet. Allow your dinner guests to pick and choose what foods they want to eat. Now, in turn, what we should be doing as course designers is that we should be allowing our students to pick and choose how they want to learn. And when he said that, it was just like mind explosion. I was like, oh my gosh, Tom, what an incredible way to think about trying to design our courses for the future. And that's what I want people to be able to think about. Listen to student voices, collect this feedback, and figure out what went well. There's a lot of things that we talk about within higher education and remote learning and online learning and everything else too that didn't go well. Understand that. But let's put that to the side for a second. Not everything was a catastrophe. There are plenty of amazing and successful stories that are out there where students actually did enjoy online learning more and they were never exposed to it. So take those elements, collect that student feedback, listen to student voice, and figure out what we can do to then take all this information and then to apply this into our own design process. And this is what I'm seeing as the biggest opportunity. Imagine a world where students are able to essentially design their own learning experience. So think about it from the best way to describe it is in my mind, I think about hybrid courses, but I know that that terminology has changed. Where now the correct wording to actually say is more of a blended learning approach. So you're taking some from face to face, you're taking some from online learning, and you're capitalizing on all their strengths and putting them together. And if I had to think about the next steps in education, how we can actually move forwards, I think about a world where instructors are hosting both in person office hours as well as virtual office hours. Perhaps some of them would go to the virtual more because they're not as embarrassed to do so instead of going up to somebody after class and talking to them. Perhaps they're not going to have as much anxiety about going into a Zoom room because that's now what they're used to and it's what they are accustomed to. I imagine a world where students can pick and choose about do they want to have their lessons within the virtual space or do they want to have their lessons in person? And I think about trying to just like host different types of group projects. Do you want to host in person? Sure. But if you want to use something like GatherTown or Unhangouts, I mean, you have all of these possibilities. There are all these different forms of tools that we can use in order to become successful. And I'll just mention GatherTown. Let me harp on that one for a second. The other day, I was attending a conference at MIT, and I had never used anything like GatherTown before. And this thing just blew my mind. I have a virtual character that was attending this conference. The virtual character then had to move towards the room to find the keynote speaker. And just like in some type of a video game, the keynote speaker was on the stage. I had to go and find my seat and sit down, and then it allowed me to start listening to him speak. And then afterwards, the hosts of the conference came into the room and said, "Hey, we're going to now have our types of poster sessions. Feel free to leave this virtual room and then to go into the next one." So, just like how if I was leaving a conference, I'm in a meeting hall and then I leave and I go out into the hallway, I then saw the poster sessions. I then saw people gathering around and talking. Now, what happened is that my little character moved into the conversation with other characters, and slowly I started to hear more from other people speaking, just as if I was slowly approaching a crowd and I could start to hear the conversation. And then all the windows popped up and I was literally in the conversation. It was almost like taking an embedded video conferencing software and just placing it inside of there. And then, of course, if I wanted to leave the conversation, just like how I normally would, I would walk away and then the audio slowly started to fade away. So you could do this with group conversations, with individual, you could have private conversations where you would just, of course, like anything else, go and find a couple of chairs or couches to go and sit and talk to somebody off to the side. You can do all of those things. But this is what I'm imagining. I'm imagining students allowing them to do their group work and to do exercises and activities together in this whole different type of sense that we never thought was possible. But there are many tools out there, and I just use GatherTown. There are a ton of other different examples too, but I had no idea existed. And that's the long story I'm trying to say here. We have all the tools. We have all the technology. We have all the innovations. It's now time to capitalize on that, to think about this, to listen to the students' voices, and then to apply that into how we design courses. And that is what's going to make us advance as a society. That's what's going to make us move forwards. Now, there is a new book that's coming out in May that I do want you to be on the lookout for. I was really fortunate enough to be able to read it ahead of time, and it was awesome. And I highly encourage you to do the same. This book is all about blended learning. It's from Dr. Novak and from Dr. Tucker. They took the concepts of UDL, blended learning, put them all together, and it's just awesome. So be on the lookout for that book. At the time of this recording, it is titled UDL and Blended Learning Thriving in Flexible Learning Landscapes. It's forward thinking, written by smart people by the book. Now, our next question comes from Heidi, and Heidi says, "How did you get into baking?" Thank you, Heidi, for the fun question. I appreciate that. And thank you for not letting me have to try to think about how to answer some of these complex questions. So, for this, during the pandemic, apparently there's been a movement of like pandemic bakers. I had no idea that this is a thing until a friend of mine the other day mentioned it. I was like, oh, I didn't realize that I was not alone in this whole journey. I've been watching more and more YouTube videos, and one of the channels I really like and enjoy is a series that are called the Try Guys. And the Try Guys are four dudes who just try things and see how it goes. It's like an experimental channel. Sometimes they're successful and they're amazing. Other time they learn some important lessons along the way, and then they go and take back all this information with them, and then they try to revisit some of these things again and again and again. And one of their series that has been really interesting to me is something that is called Without a Recipe. Now, it's exactly what you think about. These four poor people try to try to think about how to do baking without any form of recipe on hand, and they're literally just winging it. And actually, the poor people are really the judges who are having to go and eat some of these monstrosities, and sometimes they're amazing, and other times not so hot. So I was inspired by that, and I was like, I really still want to try baking, and why don't I give it a shot? So I attempted to experiment a little bit, and definitely did not do so great the first couple of times. And then my wife actually got me a couple of different things for Christmas. She got me a book that is called Delish by Joanna Saltz, I think is her name. And that book is awesome. So it gave me a little bit more instructions. And she also got me a couple of accessories too that I needed. So then I also talked to a couple of other bakers just to get some like very basic tips. And then I was able to take that, apply that into what I have been doing. And now I am pretty dangerous when it comes to baked goods. So the other day, I made something that I'm calling a peanut butter cup explosion cookie. It was a chocolate cookie. And then in the middle, I ended up stuffing peanut butter and then a peanut butter cup and then Reese's Pieces. And I just like threw it all together into the middle. And oh my gosh, insanely good. Don't know how many calories it has, but I can absolutely tell you that we have had to start working out harder in this family because I was definitely going to make everyone in this household gain a lot of weight. So I've been trying to give some of my baked goods to my neighbors and other people nearby, saying, "Please take these because if not, we're all doomed." So that's one of the hobbies I picked up during this time frame. Next question comes from Nadezhda, and she asks, does certification matter in instructional design equal more or less than experience? I very often see this requirement in job announcements, but then following different people of this field, I often hear about the importance of experience without any formal education or certification in ID. So I was wondering whether it's a more organizational hiring thing or it's common everywhere. Thanks. Now, this is a great question. And unfortunately, there isn't a straight answer. So I'm going to do my best to give you all the information you could possibly need in order to try to make your next decision. So, little background here. Why is this so confusing? We're talking about life experience, talking about credentialing. Why is there this conversation in the first place? Well, the reason is because instructional designers come from all different walks of life. You're going to have some folks who they never went to school to become instructional designers, and now somehow they found themselves in this position and they're like, okay, this is what I did. And they're sharing their stories with other people. And that's the thing is that if you talk to like five instructional designers right now, you're going to hear about some people who, yes, they went back to school and they got their master's, or perhaps they were already in a type of a training role. So it just made sense to transition over from training into instructional design. Maybe they were a former teacher. So they know about education and how people learn, and they just use that knowledge in order to become an instructional designer. Maybe it was somebody who was in something like myself, where I was in more of the design field. My background was in graphic design, and then from graphic design, I became a academic advisor over time. So I took my knowledge of design with my knowledge of the student learning experience, combine that together. And that really did work out for me in the end. So, depending upon who you ask, you're going to get all these different answers. Now, the folks who have the life experience, they certainly have an advantage. They're going to be able, if you ask them a question, they can actually tell you. So, for instance, if you say, tell me about your course design process, tell me about how you revise courses, tell me about how you work with difficult SMEs and how you handle them. We're able to tell you about all these things and give you a straightforward answer that is logical and is easy to follow. And most likely, over time, since they've been doing this with a number of years of experience, they have naturally accrued a type of portfolio or something else that demonstrates their work. So that's like the life experience side of this answer for you. Now, let's talk more about the credentialing side. So, let's say that we have people going back to school for their master's in instructional design, which has now become a very common thing. It's really now where the higher education industry is taking instructional design towards. But maybe they didn't go back to school for a master's. Maybe they decided to get a certificate in instructional design. A lot of universities and institutions are offering those now, or perhaps they're doing some other form of upskilling, but still in a type of a credentialed way. So, because we're talking about higher education in this sense, they are certainly looking for credentialing. And of course, this is going to be a little bit different from something like just taking courses on LinkedIn Learning or some other form of a upskilling platform. Now, if you're looking to get into the corporate world, but still has some form of credentialing, I would highly recommend to look into Idle Courses Academy. Dr. Sargent has really built out a fantastic way for folks to learn about everything from the needs of a corporate instructional design institution and what they're really looking for, and allowing you to be able to really develop the necessary trainings and skills and tools and everything else you could possibly need in order to advance into the corporate ID world. So there are ways to do this in both from the higher ed perspective and from doing this from the corporate perspective. But at the end of the day, what it all comes down to is your knowledge on instructional design, on education, on how people learn. If you can talk about some of these processes and how everything all comes together from the learning experience side of things, that's really going to be beneficial for you in the end. You need to be able to clearly and articulately describe and to demonstrate about all of these complex topics and how to really make it simplified and to explain it to somebody. Now, of course, I understand that you need someone to take a chance on you. That's definitely like the biggest thing. Whatever you do, wherever you're trying to become an instructional designer, you need someone to give you the opportunity to show that you can knock this out of the park. I totally get that. And I know that some of these opportunities are far and few between. Yes, instructional design is growing now more than ever. Everyone is hiring for instructional designer. It's absolutely crazy. Great to see, but absolutely crazy. What I want to say to you is to be prepared to capitalize on that opportunity. When it comes, don't let it slip by. Be absolutely ready to answer any question. Practice your answers out loud so that way you know when you have your interview, it's not just words inside of your head. You can actually articulate everything, say it out loud, and everything of the sort. You're really trying to show that you're confident in your ability and you know how to do everything when it comes to design. I'm so sorry because that is such a long answer for you, but I did my best. It's a very tough question to answer because of different employers, different organizations for what they're looking for, but different industries too. It absolutely matters what industry you want to go in. That would change up that answer for you. So I hope some of my perspective helps out, even just a little bit, to help guide you in the right direction. All right, folks, that is all I have for you today. I hope you enjoy this. I hope some of these questions and answers are valuable for you, applying that into your life. Some of them are real doozies. I got through them the very best that I could. But if you did enjoy this video, please share it with someone else who you know is going to enjoy it, who can benefit it from as well. This instructional design field is absolutely exploding in growth, but there are still a lot of people out there that have many questions and they don't have a lot of answers. So maybe I'll do more of these. This is actually really fun, very tricky, but it was really fun to go through and to answer some of these questions. If you liked everything too about this channel, don't forget to subscribe, like, comment, and all that other good YouTube stuff you know how to do. And if you want to go and learn more about myself or the podcast, this channel, the Institute, or anything else, head on over to drlukehobson.com. That's all I have for you today. Stay nerdy out there. I'll talk to you next time.